thanks again for inviting me. So what I will be talking about today is a study called Cross-Linguistic Influence in LN Norwegian. You may notice that I've changed the title a little bit from L2 to LN because, well, I will talk about this also during the talk, that it's not really L2 actually. And we're looking at comparing offline and online measures. This is joint work with my collaborators, who you can see here on the slide. So Merete Andersen, Natalia Mitrofanova, and Ludovica Seratrice from UIT. I think none of them are here, unfortunately, although I can't really see now who's here. So this is a joint effort with between the four of us. And so the main topic of this study that I'm presenting today is cross-linguistic influence, or CLI, as I will be referring to it during the talk. And this is very broadly defined here as a phenomenon whereby different languages in a speaker's mind can influence each other. So when speakers learn a new language, they already have at least one, and in many cases, two or more languages that have been acquired previously, and that can theoretically all influence the target language. And CLI is a widely tested phenomenon in bilingual speakers. However, there are a couple of research gaps which the present study aims to fill. So first of all, most studies have been concerned with production and to a lesser extent comprehension, but almost always offline comprehension. So it's less clear to what extent previously acquired languages can also affect the processing of the target language. And so to address this gap, we will combine offline measures using a judgment task and online measures using self-paced reading. And the second research gap is that the majority of studies compare multilinguals to monolinguals. And this doesn't really allow us to disentangle between CLI or general effects of multilingualism. So it may be the case that bilinguals or multilinguals behave differently from monolinguals, not necessarily because of influence from their other language, but for instance, because of reduced input in the target language, or maybe cognitive issues that result from being a bilingual and having to juggle several languages. So in this study, we will compare different groups of bilinguals to each other, keeping the target language constant, so that any differences that we find can be safely attributed to the influence from the other language or languages. And in this particular case, the target language is Norwegian, and the different native languages are English, Dutch, Spanish, and Italian. Now, I should also mention something about L3 acquisition, because while this study wasn't explicitly designed as an L3 study, the population we're looking at can be expected to have, at least to some extent, also knowledge of English and possibly other languages. So this is something that we have to take into account. And of course, when we have multiple previously acquired languages, another question we can ask is from which language do we see more influence on the target language? And there are a couple of L3 models out there that make different predictions. Some models predict more influence from the L1. So the idea then is that this language has been internalized more and therefore is a more robust source of transfer. We also have the L2 status factor, which basically predicts the opposite, so more transfer from the L2. And the reasoning behind this is that the L2 is usually acquired in a more similar way as the L3. So that is through classroom instruction and more like explicit type of learning. And so therefore the two languages have a similar status in the mind of the learner. That's the idea there. And then finally, there are models that assume transfer or cross-linguistic influence from either language, but depending on typological similarity. And there are two different versions of this model, let's say. So the one that predicts wholesale transfer from the typologically closest language, and the one that predicts property by property transfer. Okay, so with this in mind, let's talk about possessive pronouns. So that's the target phenomenon in this study. And possessive pronouns are an interesting property to look at if you talk about cross-linguistic influence, because there is a lot of cross-linguistic differences between languages in terms of gender agreement with possessive pronouns. So in English and Dutch, the pronoun has to agree in gender with the possessor, right? So we have John kisses his mother, Mary kisses her father. But in Romance languages, as many of you will know, the pronoun agrees with the possessum, so the possessed noun. So we would have Gianni bacia sua, feminine madre, and Maria bacia suo, masculine padre. I say Romance languages, and this includes Spanish, even though morphologically the third person pronoun in Spanish is actually the same for masculine and feminine, so it's always su, but it's assumed that this is like a morphological accident, let's say, and that underlyingly the pronoun does agree with the possessum in the same way that Italian does. And the reason we assume this is because we do see this agreement in other parts of the paradigm. So for instance, with first and second person plural pronouns, we do see, for instance, nuestro and nuestra agreeing with the possessum. Now, what's interesting about Norwegian is that it actually has both these agreement configurations, which I will explain a bit more in a minute. But first, I would like to give a quick overview on the previous research that has been done with possessives. So like I said earlier, most of the work has been done on production, and also most of the work has been done on L2 English. And this research generally shows that native speakers of Romance languages, but not Dutch, as one study shows, sometimes produce the wrong pronoun, and especially when there's a mismatch between the gender of the possessee or the possessum and the gender of the possessor. So they would say things like Mary kisses his father, because in Romance languages, those two, the pronoun would agree with the possessum. And this, of course, suggests transfer from the respective L1s. However, a bit puzzlingly, the same effect has also been attested in Mandarin, L1 Mandarin speakers of L2 English. So it could be the case that there's also some sort of, maybe in addition to cross-linguistic influence, there might also be some universal preference for agreement with the possessum. So that's a bit unclear. Now, there's one study that I would like to discuss a bit in more detail because it's particularly relevant to our study. And this is a study by Solago and colleagues from 2018. And what they did is they compared speakers. So they looked at L3 or LN German, and they looked at Spanish and English bilinguals, and they compared speakers who were L1 English, L2 Spanish, and the other way around. So L1 Spanish, L2 English. And they also looked at possessor agreement. So basically, they looked at the difference between ihr and sein in gender, and those agree with the gender of the possessor. So this is the type of agreement that overlaps with English, but not with Spanish. And they had felicitous and infelicitous sentences. So in the felicitous sentences, ihr or ihre is used when the possessor is Frau Schmidt, and seine when the possessor is Herr Schmidt, and vice versa in the infelicitous sentences. And they also compared match versus mismatch sentences. So they compared a condition where the gender of the possessor matched the gender of the possessum or where it didn't. And what they found, so they also, just like us, they had a judgment and self-paced reading. And they found that in judgment, the L1 English speakers were faster at rejecting infelicitous sentences than L1 Spanish speakers. And they also found that for the L1 Spanish group, there was actually a beneficial effect of proficiency in L2 English. And in self-paced reading, they also found an effect that only the L1 English group actually slowed down for the infelicitous sentences. So this is taken as evidence for CLI, because there is a beneficial effect of knowing English, especially if it's an L1, but also if it's an L2. But they didn't find this mismatch effect that they were looking for, which goes against findings from production, which find errors mostly when there's a mismatch. And what they say is, okay, possibly this is because in production, the pronoun and the possessum noun are planned jointly. And so the gender of the noun can actually influence the gender of the pronoun at the planning stage already. Whereas in comprehension, at least in languages like German, the speaker encounters the pronoun first and then the noun. So there can't be interference from the gender of the noun onto the pronoun, because the pronoun is read first. And this is also where our study comes in, because we look at Norwegian, and in Norwegian, the pronoun actually follows the noun. So this will give us hopefully some more insights. Okay, so now a bit about possessives in Norwegian. As I just said, the unmarked position is postnominal. So Oscar vasket bilen sin, Oscar washes car his. You can also have it prenominal, but it's less frequent, and it's more in written language and more formal. And as I also mentioned before, the pronominal system in Norwegian exhibits agreement both with the possessor and with the possessum. And there's two different types of pronouns that are used for each of these types of agreements. So we have a local or reflexive pronoun, which is sin for masculine, si for feminine, sit for neuter. And there's a non-local, non-reflexive pronoun, which is hans for masculine and hennes for feminine. So the local reflexive, so sin, si, or sit, is used when the possessor is the local subject. And so when this is the case, the pronoun has to agree with the possessum. So Johan kisses his own mother or his own father. The pronoun there has to agree with the noun, with the possessum. And this is similar to what we see in Romance languages. But the second type of pronouns, so hans and hennes, the non-local ones, are used when the possessor is outside of the finite clause. So, for instance, in a sentence like Peter is angry at John because John kisses his mother, and his referring to Peter, not his own, then we have to use this pronoun, and this one actually agrees with the possessor. So we use masculine here because it has to agree with Peter, right? And this is similar to the English and Dutch agreement system. Okay, now one more thing to point out is that the use of the wrong pronoun, so hans instead of sie, for instance, leads also to an infelicitous sentence. So in this particular sentence, Peter is angry at John because he kisses his own mother. You can't use hans, you have to use sin. And this difference between the two pronoun types is not found in any of the 4 languages in our sample, because all of them only have one form of the pronoun. So this is the same. This is kind of a control condition we have that should be the same for all the languages in the sample. Okay, now to the present study. So the questions for this study are, does cross-linguistic influence occur at the level of representation, processing, or both? And does cross-linguistic influence come from the L1, the L2, or both? And we had 5 groups of participants. So one group of Norwegian native speakers, just to see if the task works really, and if they respond to the conditions that we hypothesized to have an effect. And then we had 4 groups who had Norwegian as their second, third, fourth, whatever language. And these were native speakers of English, Dutch, Spanish, or Italian. And they were all older than 18 at the time of testing. They had acquired Norwegian after age 16. There were no early bilinguals, so also no early bilinguals with any other languages. They should have a proficiency of higher than A2 for reading, at least in Norwegian. And they all were resident in Norway, and they were not dyslexic. So the conditions we had were the following. So we had the local condition. And this is the condition, as you may remember, where the pronoun has to agree with the possessum, which is similar to Spanish and Italian. And within the condition, we had several versions of the same sentence. So the baseline sentence was a sentence where the pronoun, the possessor, and the possessum were all of the same gender. I will give an example here in Italian because I think that's probably what is easier for some people, at least, to read or to understand than Norwegian. Okay, and then the second version of the sentence was a sentence with a gender violation. So here, the pronoun doesn't agree with the possessum as it should, but it actually agrees with the possessor. So this is ungrammatical for this type of pronoun. So this would be something like Gianni and then suo madre. And then there's also a felicitous sentence, but with a mismatch. So here the pronoun agrees with the possessum as it should, but the possessor is of a different gender. So something like Maria, and then Maria is the possessor, and then suo padre. So this we thought may have an effect on the Dutch and the English speakers, because in their L1, the gender of the pronoun should agree with the possessor. So maybe they might not like this one as much as the baseline sentence, even though both of them are felicitous. And then we have the non-local condition, where the pronoun should always agree with the possessor, similar to English and Dutch. So I will give now the examples in English, because for clarity. So in the baseline condition, again, we have all the elements of the sentence in the same gender. And then, so for instance, John as a possessor, and then his father. And then there's the gender violation condition, where the pronoun doesn't agree with the possessor, which makes it ungrammatical for this type of pronoun. So this would be something like Mary, his father, feminine possessor, masculine pronoun. And then there was a condition where the pronoun agrees with the possessor. So it's a felicitous sentence, but there's a mismatch with the gender of the possessum. So for instance, John as a possessor, his mother. And this would be a mismatch for maybe for the Spanish Italian speakers, because in their L1, the pronoun should agree with the possessum. So they might like the sentence a bit less than the baseline sentence. And then finally, we have, in this condition, we have a fourth sentence type, which where the wrong pronoun is used. So the non-reflexive is used instead of the reflexive. So Hans instead of seen. And here, this is sort of a control condition, as I mentioned earlier, because here we don't expect any differences between the L2 groups, because all the languages actually differ from Norwegian in this respect. Okay, so I hope this is clear. It's always a bit tricky for me to explain this to non-Norwegians, because it's quite a complicated paradigm. Here's just an example of an actual sentence that we used in the task. So in Norwegian this time, this is an example in the local condition. So there was always a preamble to establish the reference. In this case, there's only one reference, Ella. So Ella doesn't like to dance in front of others. And then in the baseline condition, she dances with her sister at dancing class every Saturday. So here we have to use a reflexive pronoun because the possessor is the subject of the sentence. And in the baseline sentence, all the elements are feminine. So So the possessor is feminine, and the possessed noun, the possessum, is also feminine. And then we have in the second sentence, we have a gender violation. So now it's all the same, except now we have brother instead of sister. But we have the feminine pronoun. So this is ungrammatical because the masculine pronoun should have been used here. And then one more example of the non-local condition. So here we have a preamble which mentions two reference, David and Mia. David doesn't play with Mia so often, but he plays with her sister at daycare every Monday. And here the non-local pronoun should be used because the possessor is in the previous sentence, Mia. And here again, we have the baseline sentence, which has only feminine elements. So the feminine possessor, feminine possessum, and the feminine pronoun. And then in the second sentence, you see the gender violation condition. So now instead of Mia, we have Mike. So David doesn't play with Mike so often. And the rest of the sentence is the same. He plays with her sister. So now this becomes infelicitous because the feminine pronoun tenant doesn't agree with the masculine possessor, Mike. Okay, so I hope this is clear. Now we had 48 target items. So half were in local condition, half in the non-local condition. And as I said, there were 4 versions of each item. The sentences were very similar. So the possessum was always a family member. So either a mother, daughter, sister, aunt for feminine, and father, son, brother, uncle for masculine. We just varied with proper names, with the verbs, and with the adverbials of place and the days of the week, which, so every sentence ended with an adverbial of place and the day of the week. We also controlled for frequency of all the words and the number of syllables in the critical and in the spillover regions. And we also had a bunch of distractor items which targeted word order. Okay. Now, we tested all of this online using Gorilla, and the participants did 2 sessions, and there had to be at least a week in between the 2. So in the first session, they got the background questionnaire, so a lot of questions about length of exposure, amount of use, instruction in Norwegian, etc. And then they had the self-paced reading task, plus also a working memory task, which was an NBAC task with numbers, and a Norwegian proficiency task, which was a closed test. And then in the second session, they had a speeded judgment task, which had exactly the same items as the self-paced reading task. But because there was a week in between, we assumed that they would have forgotten them. And then in the second session, English proficiency was also tested, plus a really short sort of metalinguistic task on to check whether they know pronominal agreement in Norwegian, if they can sort of explicitly say whether you have to use Hans or Hennes in a certain sentence, and the same for English. Okay, but I have not looked at everything yet. So the working memory task and the metalinguistic tasks, I won't be talking about those because I haven't looked at that yet. And here is just a quick example of what an item actually looked like. So in the speeded judgment, they would see first the preamble sentence and then the critical sentence. Of course, the pronoun was not read in the actual task. It's just here for clarification. And they just had to say yes or no to a sentence. And they got, I think, 5 seconds to do so. And then in self-paced reading, it looked like this. So they saw the sentence word by word, first the preamble as a whole, and then this. Again, this was just black. And then there was a comprehension question for about 30% of the sentences, just to check whether they were paying attention. The comprehension question was also in Norwegian, by the way. I just put it here in English. And then if they answered the comprehension question wrong, they would get this to sort of, to remind them that they had to pay attention. Okay, so again, just to repeat our research questions were, does cross-linguistic influence occur at the level of representation, processing, or both? And does it come from the L1, the L2, or both? Now, the hypotheses were, if cross-linguistic influence occurs, we expect the L1 Dutch or English speakers to be more sensitive to gender violations in the non-local domain, but to mismatched sentences in the local domain. And the reversed for the Spanish-Italian speakers. So they should be more sensitive to gender violations in the local domain and to mismatched sentences in the non-local domain. And we also expected an effect, beneficial effect of L2 English proficiency in the non-local domain for the Italian and Spanish speakers. And for the sort of control condition about the locality constraint, we expected no differences between the groups. So now I'm getting to the results. So these are the results for the judgment task, and this is showing you the results for the gender violation. So we have the 3 language groups, so Norwegian, Dutch and English, and Spanish and Italian. Then we have the local domain and the non-local domain. And on the left is always the baseline sentence, which was felicitous. And on the right, we have the sentence with the gender violation, which was unfelicitous. And we see that Norwegians do indeed reject the sentences with the gender violations, although not extremely categorically, but they reject it. And the L2 groups actually don't. So they say yes more often than no, but they do reject them more often than the baseline sentence, which shows us that they do realize that they're not great. But actually, there's no difference between the L2 groups here, but there were some effects. So there were effects of Norwegian proficiency, age of onset of Norwegian, and amount of instruction in Norwegian. So if the more proficient learners, lower age of onset and more instruction were more accurate. But the interesting part here is that there was also an interaction between English proficiency and domain and group. So I'll show you that here. So what you see here is that English proficiency mattered, but differently for each group. So for the Spanish and Italian speakers, English proficiency helped them particularly in the non-local domain, which is the blue line. So here we have English proficiency on the x-axis and accuracy on the y. And so in the non-local domain, they are, and this is where Norwegian overlaps with English. So, and this is where English helps them, but it actually, English hinders them in the local domain. Okay, so this was gender violation. Here we have the mismatch condition. So here we see the baseline and the mismatch sentence. So as I mentioned, both were felicitous. And so we also see that all groups actually rate both sentences very highly. And we also see that there's no mismatch effect here. So there's no differences between the baseline and the mismatch condition for any of the groups. There is an effect of English proficiency, which means that the better you know English, the more accurate you are overall, which was actually a bit surprising because it should matter mostly for the domain that overlaps with English, right? But there's also an interesting effect of Norwegian proficiency, which is modulated by domain and group. And this is what we see here. So we have Norwegian proficiency on the x-axis here and accuracy on the y-axis. And we see that for the lower end of the proficiency, the Spanish and Italian speakers, so the blue line, actually perform better than the English and Dutch, but only in the local condition, which is the one that overlaps with Spanish and Italian. And this is not the case for the non-local domain. And finally, we have the locality violation, which was sort of the control condition. Here you only see the non-local condition, because this version of the sentence was only part of the non-local condition. And so here the violation lies in the use of the wrong pronoun, so Hans instead of sin. And we see that Norwegians tend to reject sentences with the violation, again, not very categorically, but the L2 speakers tend to accept them. Even though, again, they do make a distinction between the baseline and the condition with the violation. So they are somewhat sensitive to this distinction. There was also an effect of Norwegian proficiency and amount of instruction. So as people became more accurate or more advanced in Norwegian and were more instructed, they were better at rejecting the sentences with the violation. But crucially, there's nothing that indicates any difference between the groups. And this is exactly what we expected, because this is the control conditions, and both groups should be equally good or equally bad at this. Okay, now we'll go to self-paced reading. And here we have all the results in one graph, basically. So I will explain this to you. So what we see here is, again, the local and the non-local condition and the three language groups here. And we're interested in the gray marked part of the sentence. So that is at 0, that's where the pronoun is. And then we have the 3 segments that follow it. So those are that's the spillover region. And we have the different conditions here in the different colors of the line. So for gender violation, we need to compare the green line, which is the baseline, to the red line, which is the sentence with the gender violation. And for this condition, there was actually a main effect of domain, meaning that the group as a whole, so all speakers, were more sensitive to gender violations in the non-local domain compared to the local domain. But there was an interesting interaction between domain and language, which means that the difference between local and non-local is actually more pronounced in the Dutch and English speakers than in the Spanish and Italian speakers. So this means that the Spanish and Italian speakers actually did relatively better in the local domain and relatively worse in the non-local domain, which is, again, in line with what we predicted. There was also an effect here of length of residence. So that's what you see here. So the more time people had spent in Norway, the more sensitive they became to this gender violation. And then for the mismatch condition, we need to compare the green line to the blue line. But as you can see, those lines are very close to each other for all of the groups. So there was really no effect there. And finally, for the locality violation, so this was only part of the non-local domain. And here we have to look at the orange line. So the orange line compared to the green line. And what we see here is that Norwegians do show some effect here, so they slow down a bit. But the other groups don't seem to do so. And statistically, the Norwegians were also more sensitive than the other groups. And there was no difference between the L2 groups, which again was in line with what we predicted, because all the languages in the sample lack this property in their L1. There were also some effects which are maybe not so interesting, but I will mention them anyway. So these were just effects on overall reading times. So basically, people who were more proficient in Norwegian, interestingly, also people who were more proficient in English, people who were younger, and people who used their native language less seemed to be just faster readers. Okay, so this was a lot of information. So I'll just summarize it for you. What we found some effects that were evidence for cross-linguistic influence. So for judgment, we saw that at lower levels of Norwegian proficiency, Spanish and Italian speakers were better than English and Dutch speakers at accepting grammatical sentences in the local domain only. We also saw that the same group of Spanish and Italian speakers were helped by English proficiency in detecting gender violations in the non-local domain. And in self-paced reading, we've seen that English and Dutch speakers were relatively more sensitive to gender violations in the non-local domain, whereas for Spanish and Italian speakers, this difference was not as pronounced. And finally, the fact that we didn't find any difference between the groups on the control condition strengthens the effect or the argument for the claim that this is cross-linguistic influence here. So, to a summary of the summary, where do we see evidence for CLI? We see it in judgment from the L1 and from the L2 and in processing from the L1. And this is actually very much in line with what the study by Lago et al. Found. And so for our research questions, does cross-linguistic influence occur at the level of representation, processing, or both? We can say both. And does it come from the L1, the L2, or both? We can again say both. However, there were differences, right, between the two different tasks. So what does that mean? So why do we see effects from the L2 English only in judgment and not in reading times? Now, we think that this has to do with the nature of the tasks. So the self-paced reading task is more implicit. It tests comprehension under processing pressure, which also affects naturalistic language processing. So this may have encouraged reliance on L1 processing mechanisms, which may be more available and more automatized because the L1 was acquired earlier, has been used more frequently in life, etc. And the judgment task, on the other hand, is likely to encourage the use of more conscious linguistic knowledge. So similar to knowledge that is used in grammar tests. An argument for this is also that we found effects from the amount of instruction in Norwegian only on this test and not for self-paced reading. And so it may be that L2 knowledge is only available, or in any case, more available maybe, in this type of tests because it taps into the same kind of processes that are used when acquired L2. And this resonates a little bit with the argumentation for the L2 status factor, although that model basically predicts more influence from the L2 than from the L1, without specifying whether this would obtain differently in different kinds of tasks. And our findings do also show CLI from the L1, even more from the L1 than from the L2. But our findings do seem to support the idea that there is some relation between the status of the language and the type of influence that we can observe. Now, interestingly, unlike the study by Lago et al., we found that the influence from the L2 English doesn't only have to be beneficial, it can also be hindering. So in the judgment task, the Romance speakers with higher English proficiency also did worse at the local condition, which means that their English knowledge is also suppressing influence from their L1, which would have been beneficial in this domain. And finally, so the fact that negative influence from the L1 in judgment only occurred at lower proficiencies in Norwegian indicates that this can be overcome as people get better in Norwegian. But this proficiency effect was only observed in judgment and not in self-paced reading, which seems to suggest that in tasks that are more implicit, the effects that we find seem to be more robust or more difficult to overcome. Okay, now there were some puzzling findings. So, for instance, there was this main effect of English proficiency for accepting grammatical sentences across the board. So for both the local domain and the non-local domain. And also there was a main effect on English proficiency on overall reading times. And this was a bit surprising because we would expect English to help you in, you know, the domain that overlaps with English, but not necessarily the other domain. Well, secondly, unfortunately, we didn't find this mismatch effect. So we hoped that we would find it because of the fact that we have the post-nominal possessive in Norwegian, but we didn't find it. So this was a bit disappointing, but we also have to think about that the fact that we only compared match and mismatch in felicitous sentences. So we basically compared these two conditions. And so perhaps this was just not enough to detect an effect. So perhaps if we would have included, so we only had ungrammatical mismatch. We didn't have ungrammatical match. So perhaps if we had all these 4 conditions, we would have maybe found that they would have accepted the mismatch condition more than the match. But the reason we didn't do this is because we didn't want to have too many ungrammatical sentences in self-paced reading. Because you have to have like at least maybe 60-70% grammatical sentences in self-paced reading. Okay, and well, just to wrap up, so the main takeaway from this talk, I would say, is that CLI can come from both the L1 and the L2, and also we can observe it at the level of both more conscious knowledge and also at the level of automatic processing. However, different results obtained depending on the type of task. So this means that it's very important in CLI research to at least be aware of what type of knowledge or what type of underlying mechanisms our tasks are actually tapping into. Now, for future directions, we still have some work to do on this data set. So we want to look at the results from the working memory task because, yeah, since they had to keep so many references in mind for the task, it's very possible that there will be an effect of working memory here as well. We also still need to look at whether they reported use and knowledge of other languages than English. And, you know, put that in the model as well. And we also, so for now, what we did is we just included all speakers and included the proficiency effects and all the background variables as predictors in the model. But another approach would be to match the groups as much as possible and then see if the effects that we find here can be confirmed if we analyze the data in that way. And finally, we're now also collecting data for German, Russian, and Polish speakers of LN Norwegian. And this will also be a very interesting data set to look at and to compare these data with, because those languages have actually are more similar to Norwegian in that they have pronominal agreement with both the possessor and the possessum. But then again, German is different from Russian and Polish because Russian and Polish have 2 sets of pronouns, like so they really work exactly the same as Norwegian. But German doesn't, because German only has 1 pronoun, which basically agrees with both the possessor and the possessum at the same time. So that will be very interesting to look at as well. Yes, and with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very curious to hear any questions or comments on this.